Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we'll be covering our 25th episode together. That is crazy. That is not including our Listener Scares episodes, but whatever. I decided that since it was our 25th episode, we needed a case with a happy ending. Because we all need a happy ending sometimes. This week, we're talking about the 1976 Chowchilla school bus kidnapping where nobody dies, nobody is sexually assaulted, no one's brutalized, and everybody makes it out alive with nothing more than some serious life trauma. So this week, I'll be telling you how an entire school bus full of kids was kidnapped by 3 really shitty men, but there's also like a hero in this one, which is better than most episodes on this podcast, let's be real. This is also one of the largest mass abductions in U.S. history still. So with that being said, let's get it. To make this episode a little bit funkier than it already is, we're going all the way back to the 70s for this one, a time where people with big hair and good weed made the world go round. It was July 15th in 1976 when school bus driver Ed Ray was doing his usual route of picking kids up from summer school and dropping them off at their houses after the end of the long day. It was about 4 p.m. when the school bus carrying 26 kids, ranging in age from 5 to 14, was hijacked by 3 men. The kids weren't actually in a regular summer school setting, though. It was more like a summer camp type of deal. And this hijacking and kidnapping happened on what was supposed to be the next to last day of this summer camp program at Dairyland Elementary School. And I say it was supposed to be the next to last day of this summer camp because all the kids that attended this program absolutely loved it. They actually loved it enough that all the kids had agreed to sign a petition to extend the program for longer than it had originally been planned to run for. And I keep saying that this seems more of like a summer camp type of deal versus a summer school where the kids were like failing and needed extra help with their grades, because from my understanding, this program was kind of set up where the kids would learn like regular school for the first half of the day, and then for the second half of the day, they would do like field trips or other fun things like that. And on the day of this kidnapping, the bus was headed home from a day of swimming. The bus driver for this route was a man named Ed Ray, who was known to everybody around town as just Ed, and known to the kids on the bus route as Mr. Ray. And Ed is the absolute best kind of human, and that statement will make so much sense on its own as we get further into this case. On this day, all Ed was doing was driving these kids home. He was doing his literal job. Ed was a well-known face around Chowchilla, California, and he wasn't just a familiar face. He was also like a very well-liked and respected Chowchilla community member. All the kids on this bus loved Ed, and fun fact about this, some of the kids that Ed was driving home that day were grandkids of people that Ed had known for years, and others were grandkids of people that Ed himself had went to school with when he was a teenager still in school. But it was on Ed's normal, everyday, regular bus route to drop off these 26 kids that Ed was driving down a back road, and he came up on a white van that seemed to be broken down. It was just kind of sitting with the hood of the van propped up, and it was a white van, and it was kind of blocking the road where Ed even had to maneuver the school bus around the white van just so that he didn't hit it. So when Ed got up to the side of the van, he just kind of slowed the bus down and hollered out to make sure that the men standing with the white van were okay, to see if they were broken down, to basically just stop and ask if they needed help. He wouldn't actually be able to help them, it was against school policy, but he could at least do the decent thing and make sure they were okay. And this would sadly be a mistake on Ed's part, but he would have absolutely no way of knowing that just by him being a good, decent person and stopping to ask if these men needed help, he had no idea that this was going to come back to bite him in the ass in the way that it did. When Ed slowed the bus to a stop and he asked these men if they needed help, 2 men were wearing women's pantyhose over their heads, and they just kind of forced their way onto the bus. They have sawed-off shotguns, and the 2 men were kind of waving guns around, making it really clear and well known to the man driving this bus and the bus full of kids that they had big scary guns and they weren't afraid to use them. The men waved their guns around some more and instructed Ed to go to the back of the bus while they yelled and screamed at the kids to shut up and to be quiet. Some of the kids remembered later on in interviews that Ed was speaking to all the students on the bus in a really serious and stern tone, which wasn't typically in Ed's character. Normally he was kind and gentle and funny, and if I were guessing, I'd be guessing that this was probably Ed's way of trying to keep himself calm enough to be able to keep all 26 kids calm too. Now, there were only 2 out of the 3 kidnappers on the bus at this point. One of the men got into the driver's seat of the school bus, and another one of the men were watching Ed and the kids to make sure that they were listening to orders and doing what they were told. The 3rd kidnapper was still in the white van that Ed had originally stopped and offered help to. So the school bus takes off, and the white van follows behind the school bus. The man driving the school bus and the white van following the bus both drove through some bamboo fields and thick brush, and the kids later say that they were just like bounced and thrown all around the bus during this ride. These poor kids and Ed, the bus driver, were basically going off-roading in a school bus, and nobody had agreed to it. So Ed and the kids were driven into some fields and brush and down into a thick wooded area that wasn't easily seen from the road. When the school bus finally came to a stop, the kidnappers had backed this white van up to the door of the school bus. And the kids were ordered to jump from the school bus into the van, because these are smart kidnappers, and obviously they figured that if they made the kids jump from the bus to the van, then the kids wouldn't leave footprints in the dirt, and the police wouldn't be able to find them later. There wasn't enough room on the first van to fit all the kids, because again, there were 26 kids plus the bus driver. But fear not, these kidnappers were thinking ahead yet again. They had a second van, a green van this time. They also backed up the green van to the doors of the bus, and they made the remaining kids jump from the school bus into the green van. So Ed is only on one of the vans with half of these kids. The other half of the kids are on the second van by themselves with no adult except for the men that had just kidnapped them all at gunpoint. This is terrifying. Because remember, some of these kids were as young as 5 years old, but still, there's only one Ed. He can't be in 2 vans at once. The vans that the kidnappers had loaded these kids into were fully prepped for this kidnapping. The windows in the vans were completely covered and blacked out. The windows had actually been painted the same color as the vans, so that absolutely no sunlight was coming in from anywhere. And they also had wood paneling covering the walls, windows, and ceilings, and even to the back part of the van where the kids were being held. Because the wood paneling also acted as like a wall that would separate the driver's seat and the back part of the van. Like, these weren't vans with seats in the back. These were the kind of vans that only have 2 seats up front, and the back is completely empty. Almost like a van that painters or electricians usually work out of. The kidnappers had essentially made tiny prison cells out of the empty back parts of these vans. The kids were then driven around in these 2 separate blacked-out vans for more than 11 hours in the middle of the summer in California. It was more than 100 degrees outside, so the hottest month of the year, at the hottest time of the day. There was also no air conditioning in either one of these vans, and even though the kidnappers had driven the vans around for more than 11 hours, they had only actually driven Ed and the kids about 100 miles away from Chowchilla, where they had just kidnapped them from. Ed and all of his students were now more than 100 miles away from Chowchilla in Livermore, California. So essentially, these kidnappers drove these 2 vans around for hours and hours and hours, just to throw off Ed and the kids' sense of time and location. The kidnappers had driven more than 11 hours. They took random back roads and did unnecessary U-turns. The kids were in the back burning up, starting to vomit, probably getting car sick or motion sick just from riding that long. They had also been driven this long with nowhere to use the restroom, no bathroom breaks, no food, no water, no fresh air, no sunlight, and no stops. The kids were being forced to use the bathroom inside of the vans while they were driving. Ed had even kind of encouraged the kids to use the bathroom in one certain spot so that they wouldn't be forced to sit in their own pee or poo. And they're all just cramped in the vans on top of each other, and Ed's just still trying to comfort the kids that are in the same van with him. I'm sure he was kind of freaking out inside about the other half of the kids that were on the other van without him, but poor Ed did his very best with comforting these kids that were in the van with him, while at the same time trying not to show that he's internally scared shitless for not only his own life, but the lives of all 26 of the kids that he's responsible for while they're on his bus. Ed was doing the absolute most for these kids, though. He started singing things like, "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands" with the kids, except that Ed kind of changed the words to the song to make it, if you're sad and you know it, clap your hands. Which breaks my heart to think about. Just think about that. 5-year-olds singing, if you're sad and you know it, clap your hands. No, that breaks my heart. They also sang songs like Boogie Nights and Love Will Keep Us Together. Now, at some point during all of this, the parents to these 26 kids are starting to realize that Ed has never been late dropping the kids off from school before. And I'm sure that at first they tried to think about rational things that would slow down the bus route, like traffic, or maybe the bus had gotten behind an accident that was being cleaned up, or maybe the bus had broken down and they were waiting for roadside assistance. But after an hour or so of the kids still not being dropped off, the parents were sure that something was wrong. They just weren't sure exactly what was going on. So parents start calling the school and calling the police and showing up at the school, and they're asking where the hell their kids are and why the hell they haven't been dropped off by the bus by now. But the school had no idea what was going on either. And of course, there were people that started to say that Ed probably took the kids and he had probably planned all of this, but Ed's wife shut that shit down so fast. Which, I get that. It does seem like the most likely scenario at first, but why do we always jump the gun? Ed's wife let everybody know that Ed loved kids more than his own life and that he would never take or hurt a kid. And while there may have been parents that thought that maybe Ed was involved, nobody could really come up with a good reason or motive to explain why Ed would try to pull something like this. It really didn't make sense. And it especially didn't make sense with how long he had been working as a bus driver and how much all the kids loved and respected Ed. The police, on the other hand, knew that they needed to start searching and that they needed to start searching now. It only took about 5 hours after the kidnapping that the school bus that Ed was responsible for driving was found in a dried riverbed, and it was parked in the thick bamboo and brush that they had driven into before. It wasn't visible to searchers on foot or people driving around and searching. The bus was actually only found when they did an aerial overview search from the sky at about 8 p.m. on the day that everybody on the bus was kidnapped. And once the bus was found in the dried-up riverbed, the police started looking around at the crime scene. And the first thing that they noticed was that the bus was empty, but that there wasn't any blood or any signs of a struggle inside of the bus. So that kind of put everybody's mind at ease that none of the kids were hurt and they were hopefully all okay, if nothing else. But they also noticed that there weren't any footprints in the dirt, which was weird considering there was more than 25 kids that would have had to have gotten off of the bus to be transported and put somewhere else. And while the police may not have found footprints from where the kids were walking around in the dirt, what they did find were 2 separate tire tracks, and both sets of those tire tracks led away from where the school bus had been found and then back onto the main road in the opposite direction of Ed's bus route. So they've managed to find the missing bus with no kids and no Ed on it. So now the police are on the lookout for 2 more vehicles with no idea of what make, model, color, or description that those vehicles are that they need to be on the lookout for. They essentially have no idea of what they're looking for, except for 2 vehicles and which way they might have been headed. One of the kids inside of the vans was 9-year-old Jennifer Brown Hyde, and she later says, quote, "I felt like I was an animal going to the slaughterhouse." That is what was going through these kids' heads while they're just driving around aimlessly. Back in Livermore, California, where Ed and all 26 of the kids were at in 2 separate vans, both of the vans finally came to a stop after a long, grueling ride and another off-roading expedition, of course. And the back door to one of the vans opens. The first person that's taken out of the van was Ed, the bus driver. And then the back door was shut again. After Ed was taken off the van, the kidnappers would come and open the door, grab the closest kid to the door, and then shut the van door again. And now Ed's gone, so all of the younger kids are looking to the older kids as, they need guidance. They're looking at these teenagers like adults. The smaller kids are just clinging on to the older kids. And even though the older teenage kids are still kids, they were kind of forced in this moment to act like adults and to not show fear. The kidnappers would pull each kid out of the bus and close the door. They would then ask each kid their name, their age, and then they would take a piece of clothing or shoes or something that belonged to them, like an identifying object. And the kidnappers did this 1 kid at a time until all 26 kids were taken off the vans. But some of the older kids on the vans had no idea where these 3 men were taking all the other kids that they're pulling them out one by one. They have no idea what they're doing to them after they pull them out of the vans. They have no idea where they're putting them after they pull them out of the vans. So one by one, these men are taking the kids off the vans, asking their names and shit, piece of clothing, whatever. And so they're taking, everybody is being walked to a ladder that leads down to a hole in the ground. This ladder led Ed and all 26 kids down into the back of an enclosed old, moving truck, maybe a U-Haul truck type of deal. And that truck itself had been buried more than 12 feet under the ground at the California Rock and Gravel Quarry. 14-year-old Michael Marshall was one of the last 2 kids to be taken out of the back of the vans and forced to go down to the ladder into the buried moving truck. And at this point, it was only Michael and a little girl named Monica left. And Monica was one of the youngest kids that was taken in this kidnapping. Michael didn't know where the kidnappers had taken any of the other kids or Ed. And his best guess was that they were being taken out and killed one by one. So when it came time for Monica to be pulled away from the van, Michael pushed her behind himself and went ahead in front of her. He couldn't stand the thought of not trying to save her. But to his surprise, all the kids and Ed were at the bottom of the ladder that he'd been forced to climb down. And luckily, not long after Michael got down the ladder, little Monica followed. Once Ed and all of his kids made it back into the back of this moving truck, the ladder was removed from the hole and a manhole cover was put on top of where the hole was. All these kids and their bus driver had essentially been buried alive. They could all hear something being thrown on top of the cover that had just been shut. And one of the oldest kids that was on the bus was 14-year-old Michael Marshall. And he said, quote, "I remember it just went dark." Michael also said, "And then you could just hear materials getting thrown on us. We were being buried alive." Larry Park, who was only 6 years old at the time, said that when they got down into the buried and enclosed truck that he was wondering how it was going to feel to die. He also said, quote, "I've never been in darkness like that before. It was just pitch black. Like the darkness was touching me. Like I was inhaling the darkness." And after the kidnappers closed and buried the lid on the moving truck where Ed and the kids were being held, they also put 2 big-ass 100-pound industrial batteries on top of the manhole cover lid. That way they wouldn't be able to open it from the inside, and then they covered that with some sort of shaft. Ed had held it together throughout this entire traumatizing experience. But once the hole where the ladder had been was closed, Ed kind of lost it. He finally cried in front of the kids, and one of the kids even fainted from fear. Once Ed wasn't able to keep it together, a lot of the kids, especially the younger kids, also lost their shit, which I could see that. Now there are 26 terrified kids and 1 terrified bus driver buried alive in the back of an old-school U-Haul truck that was only 8 foot by 16 foot. They're 100 miles away from their bus route. This truck was stacked with mattresses and also had a hole cut out of the wheel well of the trailer, and those holes were to be used like toilets. The truck also had bread, peanut butter, dry cereal, and a few huge jugs of water. But even with all the food in this truck, there was still only enough food for each person to have 1 meal before there would be no more food. There were small ventilation fans inside the back of this moving truck. Those ventilation fans were battery operated and supposed to last for at least 48 hours. They didn't last anywhere near 48 hours, and it wouldn't be long before the batteries that were supposed to run the ventilation fans would die. So, with no ventilation and the smell of urine and feces filling the back of the truck, the panic starts to set in. Ed said that he was watching the roof where the kidnappers had cut the hole for the ladder, and he was sure that it was going to cave in on top of them. One of the survivors, named Jennifer, who I think I mentioned earlier, said that once they started to hear the dirt falling in from the holes, and once they could hear the creaking from where they were convinced that the top of the truck was going to cave in on them, that's when one of the older kids that I mentioned earlier, Michael, announced to the group that they weren't just going to sit there and wait to die. The food that the kidnappers had left hadn't even lasted the group 12 hours, and between the food being gone already and the older kids and Ed being determined not to die in that hole in the ground, this is what lit a fire under everybody's ass, and that's basically exactly what they were going to need. Ed gathered a few of the older kids, and they used the only single flashlight that the kidnappers had left with Ed, and they all worked together and started stacking mattresses on top of each other to try to get the mattresses stacked tall enough so that Ed or one of the older kids could reach whatever it was that those men had covered the hole where the ladder had been with. They all remembered that it felt like it had taken them hours to get any kind of budge or movement from the lid that was covering the hole on top of the moving truck. But 14-year-old Michael said that all the younger kids were cheering the older kids and Ed on and encouraging them, and that's what kept them going through the sweat, the fear, and the exhaustion. Because even if they did manage to get the lid removed, and if they were able to get out, what if the men were standing watch outside above the ground? Because the stress of being the ones that the little ones are looking at for saving, and the exhaustion of being up all night, and the stress and anxiety that has to come with being kidnapped, all of that should have been enough to lay Ed and these older kids out, but somehow none of that mattered when one of the smaller kids did notice that the lid was actually moving. And here comes the godforsaken train. We're going to keep rolling. Ed and Michael worked together. They were trying to pry a piece of wood in between the metal manhole cover and the top of the moving truck, using it as leverage to get some kind of movement out of the lid, holding them all inside. During this time, 10-year-old Jody recalls that even after 16 hours being buried beneath the literal earth, that somehow Ed still made her feel safe. She went on to say this about Ed, quote, "I remember he actually got on to me because I swore, and Mr. Ray looked at her and told her to, quote, knock that off." And Jody, remembering back on Mr. Ray getting on to her for saying a bad word, she says, quote, "I thought whenever I get home, I'll be in so much trouble, but that's when I knew I was going home, because he made me have that hope." So we loving Ed. We're here for Ed. So with everything else going on, and on top of trying to dig his way throughout 3 different layers of secured ways to keep them in, while he's still buried alive in a moving truck full of kids that aren't his, that are all terrified, Ed still made these kids mind their manners and gave them hope that they'd all be okay, even though I'm sure he wasn't positive that they were all going to be okay. And somehow he was able to do all of this at one time, and I'm telling you, Ed is the kind of superhero that doesn't need a cape. Some of these parents of these kids that are missing remember talking to God and trying to bargain with him to return their kids safely, that they'd do anything to have their kids back. And they said that that's when they realized that there wasn't anything that they wouldn't bargain with God for just to get their kids home with them safe. That part broke my heart, because if you believe in God, I'd have to imagine that that's a hard man to bargain with. And as a mom, I know there's nothing that I wouldn't do for my kids on a regular day, much less a situation like this. But let's get back to their escape, because it's getting good. It took all of the older kids and Ed working together for hours and hours to get enough movement to where they were finally able to, inch by inch, move the manhole cover that was covering the top of the hole in the moving truck. And I couldn't really tell if the manhole cover kind of fell into the truck that everybody was in underground, or if they were able to kind of slide it over. But from the pictures that I saw, it kind of looked like it had just fallen into the moving truck that was buried. But they would soon figure out that that wasn't the only thing blocking their escape from this truck, though. The kidnappers had also built like a box type of thing that was built around the 2 industrial batteries, which were also covered in dirt. So now there are still 2 industrial-sized batteries that have to be moved that are surrounded by a makeshift box made out of plywood. And Ed had been right about the roof on the truck before, when they had all first been put into the buried moving truck underground. It was caving in, and there was a very real, very scary possibility that the roof would fall in on top of everybody if they didn't figure out how to get themselves out of there and to get out of there soon. Mike and Ed had to work together to move the 2 industrial batteries that both weighed more than 100 pounds apiece. And remember, while they're doing all of this, they're standing on top of a pile of mattresses that they'd had to stack on top of each other in order to be able to reach the manhole cover to even try to pry it open. So they're standing on mattresses, trying to move hundreds of pounds on their tippy toes while they're still trying to keep their cool and comfort 25 smaller kids. So once 14-year-old Michael was able to squeeze through the approximately half-a-foot-sized opening in the makeshift box that was above the manhole cover, he also saw that there was another layer of dirt and plywood blocking their exit. Even after they'd already gotten the batteries moved, they still had more shit to go through to get out. And this was kind of a makeshift box that the kidnappers had made as like an added layer of ensuring that nobody would be able to escape. But Michael really just never seemed to stop or give up or be defeated. Instead, he just immediately starts digging upwards with his hands towards what he's hoping would be everybody's freedom, in hopes that they could all get out alive. Michael digs for what had to have felt like hours, and during this time, Michael's just digging for his life and everybody else's life. And while he's digging, a 6-year-old that was also kidnapped with them named Larry remembers, quote, "He dug until he was exhausted, and then he kept on digging. There was no quit in him." So Michael had no quit. He was not stopping. And can we all just take a minute and appreciate the fact that Michael's only 14 years old at this time? Because I'm 30 and I feel like I would have given up so fast after my first plan had failed me. And then finally, through all the tears and the sweat and the discouraging layers to keep them all buried inside of this old school truck, Michael finally sees sunlight shining through. He digs a hole big enough that everybody should be able to fit through, and luckily for everybody involved, none of the 3 men that had kidnapped them were standing outside keeping watch. When Michael first poked his head out of the hole that they had just dug themselves out of, it was just open and empty space around this buried moving truck. But we'll get back to why the kidnappers weren't standing watch to make sure that none of these 27 people that they'd kidnapped weren't freeing themselves. And then one by one, Ed and Michael helped each of the smaller kids up and out of the moving truck that was buried underground. All 26 kids and Ed emerged one by one from the buried moving truck that had just held all 27 people in it for more than 16 hours. And they were all finally free at about 8 p.m. on July 16th. So finally, after Ed and Michael were able to get all these kids out of the moving truck that the kidnappers had buried under the literal earth, I just can't get over the fact that somebody even thought to bury a truck underground. That part just keeps blowing my mind. But I also think that it's pretty ironic that they had gotten all of these kids out of this buried truck the same way that they had been put in the truck, one by one. Once everybody was out of the moving truck that they'd been buried in, Ed and all the kids saw a man who was working at the rock quarry. And this guy was just doing his regular-ass job. And as soon as this man saw all of these kids and Ed walking towards him, before Ed or any of the kids were able to say one single word, the man just looked at all these kids and their badass bus driver and said, quote, "The world's been looking for you." And why is that such a movie-worthy moment, I swear? Which, just walking up to this man who's working had to be nerve-wracking for Ed and the kids because they hadn't actually seen the faces of their kidnappers. They didn't know what they looked like. They had worn pantyhose over their faces. They could have been walking straight towards one of the guys that actually kidnapped them. They had absolutely no way of knowing if this guy was a good guy or a bad guy at that time. Luckily, he was a good guy who'd just come to work and done his job, and he wasn't one of the men that had kidnapped him. But you know that was nerve-wracking even just walking towards somebody. And naturally, the police were called from here, and there was only really one safe place to be able to take Ed and all these kids where they'd be able to stay together, and that was the local jail. There was really nowhere else for them to be held and nowhere big enough to hold them all together in one space without traumatizing them further and trying to separate them. So they were taken to the jail and held in these big rooms that the kids said these rooms looked kind of like classrooms. They were all given clean clothes to wear, which were actually like big white jail jumpsuits, and they had given everybody these jumpsuits that were entirely too big for the kids because the kidnappers had taken pieces of clothes from every kid. Most of the boys were missing their shirts, and the clothes that they were still wearing were covered in dirt, dust, and debris. Ed and the kids were given soda and apples and taken into the big room in the jail, and they were all kept there together. And from here, of course, they were all checked out by medical professionals, and they were all physically okay. They, of course, had some serious therapy to talk through and probably some serious PTSD to work through, but they were all alive and unharmed in a physical sense. And out of all 27 people, nobody was really able to give a description of what the 3 kidnappers had looked like. They had worn pantyhose over their faces, like I said, and they hadn't really been around enough to get a real description. So Ed and the kids were held at this jail and examined and questioned about the events of the day for about 4 hours. And after being in the jail for 4 hours, Ed and all the kids were then taken and put back onto another bus, a Greyhound bus this time, and they were driven home. But I'm sorry, all of these kids, and Ed of course, had just been kidnapped from a school bus and then moved into a van that looks a lot like a bus and then buried in a bus underground, only to escape all of that and be put right back on a bus to be taken home. This had to feel like reliving their trauma in some sense. And I feel like it says a lot about the times. I feel like that wouldn't happen today. Once Ed and the kids were driven the 100 miles back to Chowchilla, all the parents and Ed's wife and his own kids were all there waiting on them. And everybody's clapping and cheering as the bus pulled up, and they're just like anxiously awaiting the arrival. And of course, there was a media frenzy there waiting on them, and all of these kids said that the whole time throughout this entire thing, they had just wanted their parents. And that as soon as they got back into their parents' arms, they immediately felt safe again, which I'm sure. And in the weeks after the kidnapping, there were a lot of media following the kids around and their families around town and asking questions every chance they got because news reporters and media outlets have no soul. And when one of the media reporters asked 9-year-old Jennifer why she thought the kidnappers would even do something like this, she didn't miss a beat and she just said, quote, "I don't know, they didn't have enough love." And that's probably the most perfect answer I've ever heard to a question like that one. Ed and all of his kids and the parents of all the kids were gifted a trip to Disney after this whole ordeal. I mean, it's a nice gesture, but it doesn't change the fact that they were all kidnapped and buried alive and forced to free themselves. But they all had a blast, and it's a special memory that they all still share. So once police start digging up the moving truck and examining the crime scene, it didn't really take police long to piece together that there was only really one person that would have had key access to the rock quarry when nobody else was around. And one of the only people with this kind of access would have been Fred Woods. Y'all want to know a little fun fact about Fred Woods? Okay, good, because I'm going to tell you anyways. Fred Woods' dad actually owned the rock quarry where Ed and all the kids had been buried alive in the moving truck. And this made Fred a pretty good person of interest almost immediately. Security guards that worked at the rock quarry had actually later testified that they had seen 3 men digging a big-ass hole in the ground for months and months before the kidnapping had ever actually taken place. And as police look a little deeper into Fred, they found that Fred had been arrested with 2 other men 2 years prior to the Chowchilla school bus kidnapping. And the 2 other men were also from wealthy and well-to-do families. 24-year-old Fred Woods had been arrested with brothers 24-year-old James Schoenfeld and his younger brother 22-year-old Richard. They had been arrested for grand theft auto, so already they weren't the smartest criminals, but they had gotten a fine and probation, probably because they come from wealthy families, and I said what I said. Fred and one of the brothers, James, were actually business partners in a used car dealership together. Fred Woods was a trust fund baby, and all 3 of these men came from wealthy families, so the reasoning behind this makes absolutely no sense, and even less sense after you know that they're all wealthy. All 3 of these men reportedly lived in, the nicest neighborhoods and suburban areas in San Francisco. So with Fred being a suspect, because he's one of the only people that had key access to the rock quarry, police were able to get a search warrant for Fred's parents' estate. And when I say that these weren't the smartest criminals, I meant that wholeheartedly. During their search of the Woods estate, they found one of the sawed-off shotguns that were used in the kidnapping. But that's not all they found during their search. They also found enough evidence to bury all 3 of these men under the jail. That pun was very much intended. The police also found a rough draft of the ransom note because, yes, these rich-ass trust fund babies were planning to ask ransom in order to let Ed and the kids go from the buried bus. During their search, police also found a paper titled Just Plan. The paper labeled Plan talked in depth about how they would execute this kidnapping, how they would handle anything that didn't go as planned. It detailed what Fred would need to do, what James would need to do, and what Richard would need to do during this actual kidnapping, and so on and so forth. They basically could have written a confession and it would have been the same. 22-year-old Richard walked himself into the police station mid-investigation and just turned himself in. He seems to be the only one with any kind of remorse during the time while this was still fresh in the public's mind and eye. Richard was the youngest of the 3 men, and he seemed to be the one that was just kind of here for the ride, just kind of going along with it for the hell of it. And after Richard turned himself in, arrest warrants were issued for Fred Woods and James. But they had money to be on the run, so of course, they were both nowhere to be found. James Schoenfeld, I really hope I'm saying that right. He was only 24 years old at the time, and he was the next dummy to be caught. He tried to evade police detection, but he wasn't good at that either, and he was caught somewhere right outside of California. The mastermind of this whole thing was believed to be Fred Woods, and he was also 24 years old at the time. Fred was caught by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Vancouver. So before I go any further, let me tell you how this kidnapping was supposed to go and what the plan was supposed to be. So, despite all three of these men coming from families with more money than they know what to do with, brothers James and Richard and their friend Fred had all gotten themselves into a pretty good bit of debt. And it wouldn't be until many years after the kidnapping had already taken place that James would finally give a reason for why this school bus full of kids was kidnapped in the first place. James said that even though all three of the men came from wealthy and affluent families, that they had either run up crazy, stupid amounts of debt or their parents had cut them off. And between one of these two reasons is why they had all three agreed to do this, kidnapping for ransom plan. And James even went on to elaborate some on why they picked a school bus full of kids when he said, quote, "We needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them. And they don't fight back, they're vulnerable, and they'll mind." So, this is the dumbest shit I've ever heard, but this entire plot to kidnap and hold a school bus for ransom was inspired by a 1971 Clint Eastwood movie, Dirty Harry. And it's believed by almost everybody that the mastermind behind the whole plan was 24-year-old Fred Woods. So even with all the evidence that they found when they'd searched the Woods estate, none of the kids had really seen the men's faces. So instead of having the kids pick these men out of a photo lineup, the police instead had all three men do a video lineup and had them say phrases that the kidnappers had said to the kids. Things like, "get to the back of the bus," and things like that. The kids and Ed were all pretty easily able to identify the men by their voices. And once the kids and Ed were able to say that, yes, these are the men that kidnapped us, all three of the men pled guilty to 27 charges of kidnapping for ransom and robbery. The three men were also charged with 8 counts of bodily harm. But all three of the men absolutely refused to plead guilty to the bodily harm charges because those charges would have held an automatic life sentence without the possibility of parole. And all three of the men were adamant that they didn't actually hurt anyone. That's debatable. Because this messed with some of these kids' heads and mental health later on so bad. And without this kind of trauma in their childhood, who knows if they would have suffered from any of these things that they suffered for, without it happening. Also, why were there only 8 counts of bodily harm? They did kidnap damn near 30 people. I don't know. This was the 70s. Childhood trauma was known, but not exactly treated. It was more of like a walk it off and rub some dirt in it kind of thing. But finally, on February 17th, 1978, all three men were given mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole, which is exactly what all these kids and their parents were hoping for. But all three men soon appealed the charges of bodily harm, and their lawyers claimed that while being kidnapped is in fact traumatic, that the men didn't actually hurt anybody physically. They didn't physically put their hands on anybody and hurt them. So the lawyers argued that by definition of bodily harm in the eyes of the law, the men did not cause bodily harm in any way that's written within the law. And with that, the men were resentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, which only meant one thing for all these kids and all their families. It meant that they would be forced to see and fight to keep their kidnappers behind bars at every single parole hearing for the rest of their lives, which is completely unfair. But let's get back to how this kidnapping plan was supposed to go. All three of these men had spent at least 1.5 years of their lives planning this kidnapping. So you'd think that they would have thought of everything, and still, somehow, it seemed like this was something that was thought up on an episode of that 70s show when everybody stoned out of their minds. So they'd kidnapped this bus full of kids, and then the kidnappers' plan had been to ask for a ransom of $5 million from the state of California, in order to get the kids and Ed back safe and unharmed. The plan that the kidnappers had come up with was to call the police department to demand a ransom of $5 million for Ed and all 26 of the kids after they'd gotten them in the buried moving truck. But after they'd already moved Ed and the kids from the school bus into 2 separate vans and then driven them around for 11 hours, only to move them into another bus that was buried underground, by the time they finished all that and they tried to call the police department, all the lines were completely busy because of the parents calling to ask where the hell their kids were. The lines were also staying busy from reporters and people all over the country calling to see what the latest news was and to see if there was anything they could do to help. So these 3 dumbasses had never even been able to get a call to go through to even demand their $5 million ransom money, even though they had tried to call multiple times. So they all decided, since they'd already kidnapped an entire school bus full of kids, moved them into 2 separate buses, and then driven the 2 buses around for 11 hours, they were just exhausted, obviously. So they'd go take a nap, probably give these parents, and the police a little more time to freak out so that they'd for sure pay the ransom money then. So that's exactly what they did. They all 3 laid down and took a little nappy nap. They decided that they'd wait and try to call back and demand ransom again when they woke up. But what they weren't expecting when they woke up was to see Ed and the kids' faces and stories of survival plastered all over every news outlet in America. Because by the time these 3 guys woke up, Ed and the kids had freed themselves and the entire nation was already cheering them on from their living rooms. Richard, who was the youngest of the 3 kidnappers, he's also only one of the 3 men that turned himself in and was granted parole. He was granted parole 36 years after the crime was committed, and he was released in June of 2012. And it would only be 3 short years after he was released that his brother Richard would also be paroled. But Fred Woods, who was the mastermind, is still in prison to this day and still doesn't show any remorse for his crimes. He's continuously in trouble in prison. He's still running some kind of family businesses from inside of prison. He's always getting in trouble for drugs and porn, and it's ridiculous. He still acts like he did absolutely nothing wrong, and that's why he's still in prison. So after the kidnapping, of course the school didn't want to use the same bus that had been used to kidnap 26 of its students, so Ed Ray bought that old school bus for $500 as a sort of keepsake or memento, just because he didn't want to see the bus be taken to the scrap metal yard and have it be crushed. He'd rather keep it. So Ed's family said that Ed parked that old school bus on the property at his house for years and years. And he'd even go out every so often and crank it up just to keep everything oiled up and working still. Ed eventually donated that school bus to an equipment museum in La Grande, and as of an article that I read that was published in 2012 after Ed's passing, the bus is still available for public viewing. A lot of the kids had recurring nightmares after their time being buried alive in a truck underground and after being kidnapped, and parents weren't exactly sure what their kids had gone through, and they'd slowly have to learn this with each day passing, exactly what their kids had been put through. And this event changed the course of a lot of these kids' lives forever. Larry, who was only 6 years old at the time of the kidnapping, struggled through severe anger issues as a teenager and young adult. And now, as a middle-aged adult, he's finally perfected the tools to live a sober and happy life. Larry's a volunteer pastor now who owns his own handyman business. And he said that he realized his resentment for his kidnappers was what was killing him. He also says that he had to beg and plead with God on how to forgive these 3 men, and after he worked through the forgiveness part, he was actually even able to go meet these men in prison. And Larry says that after that meeting, he finally, after all those years, felt peace for the first time. Michael, who was 14 years old, who actually helped Ed free all the kids, he attempted to chase his rodeo dreams, but Michael says that he was 21 years old and drunk one day, and the next day he was a middle-aged man with a really bad hangover. Michael's now also living a sober life, and a lot of the other kids that were kidnapped are parents that, have kids of their own now, and they say that this event changed the way that they parent. They're way overprotective. They're more on a way more severe level than a helicopter parent. And some of the kids that were on the bus that day had to use night lights to be able to go to sleep even into adulthood. So, this changed a lot of these kids and the direction that their lives could have gone. In May of 2012, Ed was on his deathbed at 91 years old, and tons of the kids that were on the bus with him came to visit him that day. They wanted to remind him that he'd always be their hero and that they'd never forget him. And after Ed's death on February 26th, this is celebrated in Chowchilla as Ed Ray and the Kids' Day for their heroic actions, of course. Most of the kids kept in touch with Ed all throughout adulthood and throughout the course of their entire lives. This story is exactly why I drive my kids to school, from school. I don't think my anxiety would be able to handle them being on a school bus even before this story. I've seen how them school buses drive, and it does not look safe. I'm not a very good driver, but they really can't drive. So I think that's all for this week. Remember to rate, review, and follow You can find me on any social media platform at murdered_mama, except for Facebook. Facebook, it is just Mama Murdered a Podcast. And I'll see you here, same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.